Welcome to one of the most chilling tales ever recorded in the Ozark Mountains. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're listening from and the exact time you found this story. It's always fascinating to see when and where these strange histories reach people. In the fall of 1916, when the Ozarks were glowing with red and gold leaves, the quiet town of Blackwell Springs, Missouri, became the setting for a mystery that would haunt local memory for generations. At the heart of it were two sisters, Martha and Elizabeth Blackwell, who became the focus of what would later be called one of the most unsettling medical mysteries of the early 1900s. They lived in a fading Victorian farmhouse at the end of Pine Hollow Road, about 3 miles from town. The land had belonged to their family since 1873, when their grandfather, a Union veteran, settled there after the Civil War. Martha, 28, and Elizabeth, 24, had been on their own since a typhoid epidemic claimed their parents in 1912. Locals described them as polite but distant, seen at Sunday services and town meetings, but mostly keeping to themselves. What set them apart wasn't their isolation, but something far stranger. In the notes of Dr. Samuel Harrison, a local physician dated October 12, 1916, the sisters were described as exhibiting a phenomenon without precedent in medical science. Those records, once kept in the Missouri Historical Society archives, mysteriously vanished in 1964. According to Harrison, the Blackwell sisters could somehow sense illness in others simply by being near them. The first recorded case came when Martha touched the hand of Abigail Winters, the baker's wife, and told her something dark was growing inside her. Weeks later, Mrs. Winters was diagnosed with late-stage ovarian cancer in Springfield. At first, townsfolk brushed it off as coincidence until more incidents followed. Elizabeth warned Thomas Miller, the blacksmith, that his heart beat unevenly. A month later, he suffered a mild heart attack. Dr. Harrison, initially skeptical, began documenting every case. In one journal entry from November 3, 1916, he wrote that the sisters seemed able to detect physical changes invisible to the human eye, possibly through heightened senses or subtle cues the rest of us overlook. As word spread, fascination gave way to fear. Meeting minutes from the Blackwell Springs Town Council in late 1916 show growing concern about the matter of the Blackwell property, though the discussions themselves were left out of the official record. Whatever happened in that quiet Missouri town that autumn didn't just challenge science, it unsettled the very idea of what it means to be human. By December 1916, the Blackwell sisters had nearly vanished from public life, retreating deeper into their isolated world on Pine Hollow Road. Before their disappearance from the town's routines became complete, a few unsettling encounters revealed more about their strange condition. One of the last came from Carolyn Dunham, the postmaster's wife, who told Dr. Harrison she had visited the Blackwell home in early November to deliver a package. Martha took her hand, went pale, and asked softly if she'd been feeling dizzy or having headaches. Dunham later wrote to her sister in Kansas City that she hadn't told anyone, not even her husband, about those spells. 3 days later, she collapsed in her kitchen and was diagnosed with dangerously high blood pressure, close to suffering a stroke. Around that same time, records from Piton's pharmacy showed the sisters were ordering stacks of medical texts, Gray's Anatomy journals from Johns Hopkins, and volumes on neurology and sensory perception. The shopkeeper, Frederick Peton, noted that Elizabeth had asked specifically for books on the relationship between touch sensitivity and internal awareness, a phrase that puzzled him enough to jot down in his diary. As winter closed in, the Blackwell farmhouse grew eerily silent. The sisters stopped coming to town, and according to postal records, hadn't collected mail since December 18th. A delivery boy named James Emley, only 15, then told the Blackwell County Historical Society decades later that his last trip there felt strange. The air seemed colder than usual, though the chimney smoked. Martha opened the door just a crack, refused to take the parcel from his hands, and told him to leave it on the step. Before she closed the door, he noticed her fingers, each one wrapped tightly in cloth, as if burned. She didn't meet his eyes. Another resident, Edith Claymore, confirmed similar unease. In an interview recorded by the Ozark Folklore Society in 1962, she recalled meeting Elizabeth on a forest path that December. Elizabeth stood motionless, staring at her bare hands in the freezing air. When Claymore greeted her, she quickly hid them in her pockets. When asked if all was well at the house, Elizabeth replied, "We're beginning to see beneath the skin, Mrs. Claymore. It's remarkable and terrible all at once." Her voice trembled as if she was describing something both miraculous and horrifying. Then she hurried away, her eyes distant as though focused on something invisible. What happened next remains lost to history. The brutal Ozark winter of 1916 to 1917 cut off many homesteads from the outside world. Few ventured beyond their properties. The only surviving account from that period comes from Reverend Thomas Grayson, who attempted to visit the sisters in early January after townsfolk worried about their absence from Christmas services. His journal notes the trek was treacherous, snow deep and roads impassable. When I reached the house, he wrote, "I saw smoke from the chimney and light from the windows, but no one answered when I called. Just as I turned to leave, I heard a woman's voice inside, soft, urgent, and trembling. Not in fear, but as though speaking through great strain. I could not make out the words." He left a basket of food on the porch and marked a cross in the snow to show he'd been there. It would be the last recorded visit to the Blackwell home before spring thawed the mountains and before the sisters were never seen again. When Reverend Grayson returned a week later, his footprints had long vanished beneath new snow, but the basket he'd left behind sat exactly where he'd placed it, untouched. From then on, silence cloaked the Blackwell home until February 23, 1917, when Dr. Samuel Harrison made another visit at Elizabeth Blackwell's written request delivered by a timber worker passing through town. His journal entry that day ran several pages, but one paragraph stood out. "Martha is in a state of severe distress," he wrote. "She refuses any physical examination and remains confined to the upper floor. Elizabeth is thin, pale, and exhausted from lack of sleep. Both women's hands are wrapped in heavy bandages, which they will not allow me to inspect. Elizabeth told me in her words that the touch has turned inward. I left medicine for rest and pain, though I fear what afflicts them is not merely of the body." Harrison returned uninvited 3 days later on February 26th. Inside, he found Elizabeth seated in the parlor, surrounded by sketches, unlike anything he had ever encountered, anatomical illustrations showing organs, bones, and nerves labeled with strange symbols. Elizabeth told him these were not copied from books, but seen directly through their own senses. "We have learned to perceive within," she said, pressing her bandaged palm to her abdomen and describing her digestion in startling medical detail. She declined his offer to travel to Springfield for further study. When Harrison asked to see Martha, Elizabeth refused, and the doctor noted hearing rhythmic tapping from upstairs, steady and mechanical, yet faintly human. The Blackwell sisters vanished again from public record until March 15th, when a small notice in the Blackwell Springs Gazette mentioned Elizabeth purchasing large amounts of gauze, alcohol, and laudanum from Caldwell's general store. Harold Caldwell later described her as ghostly, her hair streaked gray, her figure frail, and her movements slow and deliberate. His wife Sarah, in a letter found decades later, recalled that Elizabeth's voice was calm but strange when she said, "Martha has made a breakthrough. She can feel her own heartbeat, not just the pulse, but the chambers and valves as they move." She also requested mirrors and sewing needles, an odd combination that left Sarah uneasy. By early April, rumors swept through Blackwell Springs. Children whispered about cries coming from the sisters' house, sounds that weren't quite human. The once pristine garden lay bare. The fence sagged and the windows stayed dark even at midday. On April 12th, livery stable owner Joseph Cranmer encountered Elizabeth at the feed store. She looked frail, her skin pale as wax, her hands and forearms tightly bound in layers of linen. When he offered to carry her parcels, she recoiled violently, as though his nearness caused pain. "We've learned the body is not what we believed," she told him quietly. "Its boundaries are more porous than science admits. My sister now spends her days in internal observation." Before leaving, she asked him to tell Dr. Harrison that they had moved beyond diagnosis to intervention. Dr. Harrison made his final visit to the Blackwell home on April 29, 1917. Elizabeth opened the door hesitant and trembling. He noted that she appeared to have aged a decade in mere months. Inside the once orderly house was buried in papers, medical notes, torn journals, and grotesque sketches of human anatomy. The smell of alcohol and decay lingered in the air. Elizabeth's arms were now wrapped to the elbows, and she spoke erratically about Martha's progress, claiming they could feel themselves from within. When Harrison pressed for clarification, she grew agitated and begged him to leave. Just as he turned to go, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Elizabeth screamed Martha's name and bolted toward the staircase. Harrison followed, unaware that what awaited beyond that door would become one of the most disturbing entries ever written in his medical career, and the final known account of the Blackwell sisters. As doctor, Harrison prepared to leave that day. A faint movement drew his attention toward the back of the parlor. A narrow door left slightly ajar, leading down to the root cellar. Through the dim opening, he glimpsed what could only be described as a crude laboratory. Tables crowded with surgical tools, notebooks, and glass containers lined the space. Inside those jars were objects he could not immediately identify, shapes resembling tissue preserved in cloudy fluid. Before he could step closer, Elizabeth returned her composure, calm but commanding, and firmly escorted him out. At the door, she paused and said something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Doctor, we've uncovered something profound about perception. The body knows itself in ways science has not yet conceived. Martha has crossed a threshold I'm only beginning to approach." In the weeks that followed, Harrison reached out to colleagues at Washington University Medical School in St. Louis. A surviving letter dated May 7, 1917, from Dr. William Chambers, a respected neurologist, shows that word of the Blackwell case had begun to spread. "Your description of the sisters is extraordinary," Chambers wrote. "The phenomenon bears faint similarity to heightened proprioception, though never in such extreme form. If possible, I should like to examine these women personally. But there is no record of any such visit ever taking place." Meanwhile, the townspeople of Blackwell Springs were growing restless. On May 13th, farmer William Decker filed a complaint about foul odors drifting from the Blackwell property and strange lights flickering through the windows at all hours. The sheriff's log entry reads simply, "Investigated. No evidence of unlawful activity. Residents declined assistance." Yet a private letter from Sheriff William Tanner to his brother, discovered decades later, revealed more. "The town is uneasy," he wrote. "The sisters appear half-starved." The older one, Elizabeth, spoke of research into sensory development, but offered no details. "I saw the younger one through an upstairs window, unmoving before a mirror. Something about them chills me, but I've no grounds to act." Reverend Grayson, still troubled, made 3 more attempts to reach the sisters in May, finding the home seemingly occupied but silent. His final diary entry on June 2, 1917 reads, "I left a Bible open on their porch to Ecclesiastes 1:18. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow." As I returned to my wagon, I saw Elizabeth watching from an upstairs window. Her face bore not defiance, but exhaustion, as if she carried the weight of knowledge no person should bear. The last known sighting of Elizabeth came on June 8th, when she appeared at Peyton's pharmacy. Millicent Porter, a midwife who happened to be there later, described her as a ghost of herself, emaciated, gray-haired, trembling as she moved. Porter remembered that Elizabeth's eyes darted rapidly, as though following something unseen. When asked about her health, Elizabeth answered quietly, "Our work is nearly complete. Martha can now command her own heartbeat, directing blood as she wills. I am not far behind." Then she turned to Porter and said, "You should look more closely at Mrs. Taylor's infant. There's a shadow in the left lung." Porter thought nothing of it until days later when the baby developed pneumonia in that exact spot. 4 nights later, in the early hours of June 12, 1917, neighbors awoke to the glow of fire in the distance. The Blackwell house was ablaze, flames roaring through the collapsing roof. By the time the volunteer brigade arrived, the structure was beyond saving. When the smoke cleared, the home was nothing but ash and twisted iron from the stove. Sheriff Tanner's report noted that no human remains were immediately found, leading to speculation that the sisters had fled before the blaze. Yet those who lived near Pine Hollow Road swore otherwise, that faint lights still flickered among the ruins for nights afterward, and that sometimes, when the wind passed through the trees, it carried a sound that was not quite a voice, but something far too human to dismiss. 3 days after the fire, as cleanup crews sifted through the charred ruins of the Blackwell property, they uncovered something far more unsettling than ashes. Deep beneath the collapsed structure, Sheriff William Tanner discovered that the root cellar had been transformed into a crude laboratory, despite the damage from the fire. The space was littered with medical instruments, sealed jars containing biological specimens, and stacks of burned journals. Most of the writings were too waterlogged or scorched to read. But what remained hinted that the sisters had been conducting experiments of a distinctly anatomical nature. Then, in the farthest corner of the cellar, workers made the discovery that would end all doubt about the sisters' fate. 2 bodies sat facing each other, upright and eerily composed, presumed to be Martha and Elizabeth Blackwell. Both were wrapped almost entirely in gauze, their hands, arms, and even faces concealed beneath layers of bandaging. Strangely, though fire had ravaged the rest of the cellar, their remains showed little sign of burning, suggesting they had died before the flames began. James Fletcher, one of the volunteer firefighters present, recalled years later in an interview with the Ozark Historical Society, "It wasn't the fire damage that got me. It was how they were sitting. Straight-backed hands reaching toward each other, but not touching. Like they were frozen mid-act. They didn't look afraid, more fixed, like their minds were somewhere else entirely." Dr. Harrison arrived soon after and made his final and most haunting journal entry about the case. Dated June 16, 1917, it read in part, "The bodies were arranged deliberately, their posture suggesting intent rather than panic. Upon removing the wrappings, I found no external wounds or burns. The skin itself appeared thin and almost translucent, revealing the vascular network beneath, as though the epidermis had receded but remained intact. Among the wreckage, a metal box had survived containing several intact notebooks. These writings detailed what Elizabeth had called the mapping of the self, a method of turning their diagnostic abilities inward. The final pages claimed they had achieved total awareness of their own internal processes down to the cellular level, and believed they could consciously alter them. A previously unpublished note found among Dr. Harrison's effects decades later described his unofficial autopsy findings. Both women displayed abnormal neural development within the somatosensory cortex, he wrote, indicating an expansion of the region associated with touch and spatial awareness. More disturbing were the physical alterations, precisely placed punctures and redirected nerve pathways, consistent with self-administered neurological modification. Such procedures would require surgical expertise and anatomical precision far beyond the capabilities of untrained individuals. How they accomplished this remains beyond comprehension. Harrison concluded the entry by admitting he had withheld these details from official reports, fearing they would be dismissed as delusional or ignite hysteria among the townsfolk. The official cause of death was recorded as smoke inhalation. Both sisters were buried quietly in the Blackwell Springs Cemetery on June 18, 1917, with only a handful of townspeople present. Within weeks, Dr. Harrison resigned his practice of 15 years and left for a hospital position in Chicago. The Blackwell Springs Gazette reported that before his departure, Harrison and Sheriff Tanner revisited the ruins of the Blackwell home, removing several items from the cellar. When questioned, both refused to explain what had been taken. A final trace of the case appears in a letter from Sheriff Tanner to Dr. Harrison, dated August 3, 1917, preserved in the Missouri State Archives. "I have destroyed the remaining notebooks and specimens as we agreed was best. The last journal is now in your possession. I urge absolute discretion regarding its contents." The town is beginning to heal, and talk of the sisters has quieted. After that, the Blackwell name faded into local legend, whispered about in the hills of the Ozarks, where some claimed that even years later, strange lights still flickered among the ruins of Pine Hollow Road, pulsing faintly like the echo of a heartbeat that refused to die. Dr. Harrison's final correspondence had urged secrecy, and for a time, it seemed the story of the Blackwell sisters would fade into local obscurity. But in 1932, the case resurfaced through the work of Dr. Eleanor Shipley, a researcher in abnormal psychology at Johns Hopkins University. While studying rare cases of sensory perception, Shipley encountered references to Harrison's missing journals and became intrigued by the idea that two rural women in early 20th century Missouri had documented abilities that bordered on the impossible. Her curiosity drew her to Blackwell Springs, where she interviewed aging townsfolk who had known the sisters decades earlier. Among them was Margaret Wilson, the Blackwell family's former housekeeper, whose recollections offered rare glimpses into Martha and Elizabeth's childhood. According to Wilson, both girls had displayed unusual awareness from a young age. Martha could tell when milk had soured before any visible change, and Elizabeth could trace lost objects by gliding her hands over nearby surfaces, claiming she could feel where they were. Their father dismissed such behavior as fanciful nonsense, but their mother, a former nurse, quietly encouraged it, believing her daughters possessed what she called a nurse's intuition magnified. After their parents' deaths in 1912, the sisters began to deliberately cultivate what they once treated as coincidence, transforming sensitivity into study. Dr. Shipley's 1934 manuscript, Extraordinary Perception. The Blackwell case study attempted to provide a scientific explanation for what had long been regarded as myth. She proposed that the sisters suffered, or perhaps benefited, from an extreme form of synesthesia, a neurological condition in which stimulation of one sense produces involuntary experiences in another. In the Blackwell's case, Shipley argued their senses may have crossed in a way that allowed tactile contact to trigger complex physiological recognition, an intuitive form of diagnosis beyond conscious awareness. The manuscript also included Shipley's transcriptions of surviving fragments from the journals recovered in the Blackwell cellar. One entry, believed to be from May 1917, recorded: Elizabeth observing her sister's latest experiment, Martha has progressed beyond awareness to control. Through focus alone, she restricted blood flow to her left hand. No physical compression. Yet the flesh blanched, then flushed upon release. She describes perceiving each vessel as a distinct path, each pulse as a separate signal. Another fragment reads, "I have begun to sense the electrical impulses of my own nervous system. Individual sparks, not a continuous current. The feeling is indescribable, like perceiving each raindrop within a storm." A later undated note suggested their experiments had evolved into something far more radical. "We have proven this perception operates beyond normal sensory channels." Blindfolded Martha identified 12 sealed vials by touch alone, including subtle chemical distinctions. The mechanism must involve cellular communication outside known neural structures. By numbing the skin, dampening ordinary touch, we have reduced interference, opening the path to a deeper field of perception. Dr. Shipley's work never reached publication. In 1936, she died in what was officially ruled a laboratory accident involving chemical exposure. But colleagues found the explanation difficult to accept. One of them, Dr. Richard Tanner, no relation to the Blackwell sheriff, told Science and Inquiry in 1965 that Shipley had become increasingly obsessed with reproducing the sisters' experiments. She believed she'd achieved early results, he said. She was exhilarated and terrified all at once. Tanner also shared a final note she sent him the day before her death. "The boundaries are indeed more permeable than we have believed." After her death, Shipley's manuscripts and transcriptions of the Blackwell journals were sealed in the Johns Hopkins archives until they vanished during a 1964 inventory coinciding with the disappearance of Dr. Harrison's original medical notes from the Missouri Historical Society. The timing fueled rumors of a cover-up, though no official link was ever proven. The story might have ended there. But in 1952, nearly 40 years after the fire, the land where the Blackwell house once stood was purchased by the Ozark Land Development Corporation. During excavation for a new housing project, workers unearthed a sealed metal container buried 20 feet from the original foundation. Its contents would reignite the legend of the Blackwell Sisters and suggest that whatever they had discovered in that isolated farmhouse was never truly lost. When excavation crews unearthed the metal container buried near the ruins of the Blackwell farmhouse, they expected little more than debris from the fire. Instead, they found several glass microscope slides, each containing preserved fragments of what appeared to be human tissue, and a single handwritten note signed by Elizabeth Blackwell. Handwriting analysis confirmed its authenticity. The message contained just one cryptic line. "We have seen what lies beneath, and now it sees through us." Construction halted immediately as the University of Missouri dispatched a research team to examine the slides. Their initial findings were published briefly in the Journal of Histopathology in 1953. The paper reported that the samples displayed unusual cellular architecture inconsistent with known human tissue typology. Within weeks, however, the article was retracted without explanation, and all requests to review the samples were denied. The university quietly sealed the materials in long-term storage. In 1957, a private letter surfaced from one of the original researchers, Dr. Lawrence Pitfield, addressed to a colleague at Harvard. It was never meant for publication, but later turned up in an archive. "What we observed in the Blackwell samples," Pitfield wrote, "defies all conventional histological understanding. The cellular organization was not random. It showed patterns that suggested deliberate modification, as though the tissue had been trained to adapt and restructure itself into new forms." More alarming were the neural samples' dendritic growth, arranged in non-standard bridge-like structures that bypassed normal synaptic function. It was as if the tissue had evolved or been guided to rewire itself. Pitfield concluded by noting that the paper's withdrawal came from administrative levels far above our department, and that further discussion was strongly discouraged. After the controversy, the housing development was abandoned. To this day, the land remains vacant. Locals claim that nothing grows quite right there. Vegetation thickens unnaturally, and the forest canopy seems darker even at midday. From the hills above Blackwell Springs, the former site of the house appears as a shadowed patch that never seems to catch the same light as the surrounding woods. In 1959, an anonymous donor funded the Blackwell Initiative for Advanced Proprioceptive Research at the University of Chicago. The program lasted only 3 years, producing several restricted papers on human sensory enhancement and conscious control over autonomic functions, breathing heartbeat circulation. Its final study, Boundaries of Conscious Physiological Control, was withdrawn before publication. Soon after, the initiative was quietly dissolved and all research materials were sealed under a century-long archival restriction, set to remain closed until 2059. The last major echo of the case came in 1968, when neurologist Dr. Victor Mansfield attempted to locate the sisters' graves for potential exhumation and modern study. According to cemetery records, Martha and Elizabeth were buried side by side in Section C of Blackwell Springs Cemetery. But when Mansfield arrived, there were no headstones, no markers, just 2 unbroken patches of grass. Ground-penetrating radar revealed no signs of disturbance, no coffins, no remains. Local authorities dismissed it as a record-keeping error from 1917. But Mansfield was unconvinced. In his private research notes shared informally at a 1970 neurology conference, Mansfield wrote that he had contacted multiple medical institutions across the Midwest in search of misplaced anatomical collections. There are no official records of the Blackwell remains, he noted. But a curator at a major university medical school told me of an unusual donation received in the late 1920s, neurological specimens accompanied by detailed experimental documentation. The materials were traced to a physician formerly practicing in Missouri. Shortly after cataloging, they were removed under federal authority and transferred to an undisclosed facility. No public record of those specimens has ever surfaced. What remains are fragments, letters burned, pages missing, archives, and a single haunting sentence left by Elizabeth Blackwell, as if meant for those who would come searching decades later. We have seen what lies beneath, and now it sees through us. All official channels have since gone silent. My own inquiries to federal medical agencies have been met with uniform denials, each citing no record of the matter described. The last traceable reference to the Blackwell Sisters in any public archive appears in the minutes of the Ozark Historical Preservation Society, dated September 8, 1968. The committee concluded that while the case was of historical interest, it remained insufficiently understood and potentially disturbing to public sensibilities. A minority report by local librarian Margaret Whitley dissented, arguing that the sisters represent a case of extraordinary scientific importance, deserving recognition regardless of its unsettling implications. Her appeal was rejected. 4 years later, in 1972, a graduate researcher at Georgetown uncovered a misfiled document in the National Archives, a classified 1928 NIH report describing specimens of exceptional neurological significance obtained from a private collection in Illinois. The document referred to self-modified neural structures and evidence of voluntary cellular reorganization beyond known biological limits. Access to the full report was denied under national security provisions, and every subsequent Freedom of Information Act request has been rejected. The following decade brought only silence until 1981, when a former NIH scientist speaking anonymously to a science journalist claimed the Blackwell materials had never been destroyed. According to him, certain agencies recognized early that the sisters demonstrated an unprecedented degree of conscious physiological control. If their capabilities could be replicated, it would redefine human biology and carry immense strategic implications. He suggested that remnants of their research were still being used in classified government programs, exploring human perception and internal regulation. Today, virtually no physical trace of Martha or Elizabeth Blackwell remains. The forest has reclaimed their land, smothering what was once Pine Hollow Road beneath dense undergrowth. Locals who hike near the old property describe an unnatural stillness, an acoustic dead zone where even insects seem to fall silent. A few report stranger experiences, a sudden vivid awareness of their heartbeat of breath moving through their lungs, or of a pulse shifting beneath their skin, as though the body were whispering to itself. Scientists attribute these sensations to suggestion, but no formal investigation has ever been conducted. In 1994, construction crews expanding a hiking trail near the site unearthed a small metal box buried in the soil. Inside was a glass vial containing preserved tissue and a handwritten note. County officials quickly removed the find, claiming it was handled by higher authorities. No statement was ever released. One of the workers later told a local paper that the note bore only 5 words. The perception goes both ways now. Since then, the Blackwell case has drifted to the edge of historical memory, too strange for academia, too documented for pure legend. Were Martha and Elizabeth delusional visionaries consumed by a shared psychosis born of isolation and grief? Were they ahead of their time, early explorers of a sensory domain the brain rarely accesses? Or did they uncover something that lies between science and myth? A faculty that watches back when observed. In 2002, a neurologist at Washington University briefly revived the discussion in a paper on anomalous sensory phenomena. The study proposed that some individuals may possess enhanced interoceptive networks, neurological variations allowing conscious perception of normally unconscious bodily processes. The paper mentioned the Blackwell Sisters only once in a footnote, calling them a historical case suggestive of extreme interoceptive amplification. The author concluded, if such perception exists, it represents not evolution's limit, but its next direction. And so the record ends much as it began, with 2 women alone in a farmhouse, reaching inward to map the unseen, until the unseen perhaps began reaching back. The 2002 Washington University paper closed with a cautious but striking observation. The Blackwell sisters may have represented an extreme form of interoceptive variation, potentially magnified by deliberate training and systematic desensitization to external stimuli. The author argued that modern neuroscience with fMRI diffusion tensor imaging and high-resolution electrophysiology might finally be able to explain what appeared impossible in 1917. But without the surviving biological samples or Dr. Harrison's full records, such claims remain speculative, suspended between science and legend. In 2006, a new perspective emerged with anthropologist Dr. Marjorie Clement's book, Boundaries of Perception, Folk Practices, and Medical Anomalies in Rural American Communities, 1880-1940. Clement proposed that the Blackwell sisters may have independently reinvented practices akin to advanced Eastern meditative techniques, particularly those aimed at conscious control over normally autonomic processes such as breath, heartbeat, and blood flow. She noted parallels between the sisters' fragmented journal entries and yogic disciplines like pratyahara sensory withdrawal and kumbhaka breath retention, which can produce unusual physiological states. In Clement's view, the Blackwell case was not supernatural, but an extraordinary extension of human capability cultivated under isolation and obsessive focus. Then in 2011, the case took another turn. During renovation of the Blackwell Springs Public Library, workers discovered a sealed envelope hidden in the binding of a 1919 medical reference book. Inside were several pages of Elizabeth Blackwell's handwriting, preserved decades earlier by Margaret Whitley, the librarian who had once campaigned for a memorial to the sisters. The pages described experiments conducted in April 1917, just weeks before the fire. We have confirmed that the capacity for interior awareness extends beyond our own physiological boundaries. Yesterday, when Martha and I practiced simultaneous interior focus. While maintaining physical contact, I began to perceive her circulatory system as distinctly as my own. At first as a vague impression, then with increasing clarity until I could distinguish individual vessels and their condition. Martha reported a similar awareness of my respiratory function, accurately describing a small area of congestion in my lower right lung, which I had previously identified through self-examination. This suggests our perception operates through a mechanism independent of conventional sensory pathways. Perhaps a form of direct cellular communication, not yet known to science. Most concerning is the persistent sensation that this awareness, once established, cannot be entirely deactivated. Even when separated, faint impressions of each other's internal states remain accessible as if a permanent channel has been opened. We must consider whether such connections can ever be truly severed. Handwriting analysis confirmed the pages as almost certainly authentic. But despite their importance, they remain effectively sealed away. Officially, they are housed in the Missouri State Historical Society archives. But researchers report difficulty obtaining permission to study them directly. Even now, more than a century after the fire, the surviving evidence of the Blackwell Sisters' letters, burned journals, scattered testimonies, remains fragmented, withheld, or locked behind restricted access. What emerges from these rare glimpses is a consistent, unsettling theme. The sisters appear to have crossed not just the threshold of their own perception, but also into one another's, creating a form of shared internal awareness that could not be switched off. Whether this was a neurological anomaly, a rediscovery of forgotten techniques, or something truly new, the implication is the same. Martha and Elizabeth Blackwell were no longer perceiving the body as we know it, but inhabiting a level of experience science still cannot fully name. The 2015 discovery by Dr. Emily Tanner Wilson, great-granddaughter of Sheriff William Tanner, added a final haunting layer to the Blackwell mystery. While sorting through her family's long-stored belongings, she uncovered a sealed container holding a previously unknown report from Dr. Samuel Harrison, apparently sent to Sheriff Tanner before Harrison's death in 1943. The accompanying note instructed that it remain sealed for 25 years, a direction that was clearly ignored or forgotten. Inside was Harrison's last and most candid reflection on the case, written in the language of a man no longer protecting his professional reputation. In this report, Harrison admitted that even decades later, nothing in medical literature explained the Blackwell sisters' transformations. My examination of their remains revealed physical modifications that should have been impossible without external intervention, he wrote. Yet all evidence points to self-directed alterations at the cellular level. He traced their progression from unusual sensory acuity to something much more profound. A fundamental shift in the relationship between consciousness and physiological processes. What disturbed him most, even at the end of his life, was not their abilities, but what those abilities implied that consciousness might extend to the cellular level, bridging the gap between mind and body in ways science still refused to acknowledge. Harrison noted that their final experiments, recorded just 3 days before the fire, described attempts to mutually alter each other's physiological states through shared, concentrated awareness, and according to their own accounts, they succeeded. He concluded bluntly that the fire at Pine Hollow Road was almost certainly not accidental, but an act of self-destruction. Women who recognized that they had crossed a threshold from which return might be impossible, he wrote, and whose implications for human understanding were too profound to be safely shared in 1917, or perhaps even now. The report also revealed that Harrison had quietly withheld some samples and journal fragments from official archives, fearing they would be suppressed or exploited. These hidden materials, he wrote, indicated that in their last weeks, the sisters experienced a dissolution of the conventional boundaries of individual consciousness, their awareness merging until the distinction between Martha's perception and Elizabeth's began to blur. He hinted that the samples proved this merging was not only psychological, but physical. Yet when Dr. Wilson found the sealed report, no such samples were included. Their location, if they still exist, remains unknown. Harrison's final journal entry, also referenced in the discovered report, but lost during a Chicago Museum archival transfer in 1961, summed up his lifelong unease. I have practiced medicine for 30 years, dedicated to the principle that the human body operates according to consistent, discoverable laws. The Blackwell case has forced me to confront the possibility that our understanding remains fundamentally incomplete. What troubles me most is not what the sisters could perceive, but rather what their abilities suggest about the nature of consciousness itself, that perhaps awareness extends into dimensions we have yet to comprehend, and that such knowledge once gained may exact a terrible price. Today, Harrison's report sits under restricted access in the Missouri Historical Society, available only to credentialed researchers. The physical samples he referenced are still missing, their fate unknown. With them may lie the final pieces of evidence, proof of whether the Blackwell sisters were extraordinary human beings who expanded the limits of perception, or the first explorers of a realm where science and self-awareness converge in ways too disruptive to share. The final chapter of the Blackwell story closes not with certainty, but with absence. The sisters' graves, if they were ever truly buried, remain unmarked in the quiet grounds of Blackwell Springs Cemetery. The town library holds no photographs of them, no verified likenesses or family portraits. Their medical records disappeared decades ago, and the land where their farmhouse once stood still refuses habitation. Multiple development projects have failed, each abandoned after inexplicable setbacks or reports of unstable soil. All that endures is a story, one that medicine could not explain and history could not bury. In the rational optimism of the early 20th century, the Blackwell case was an uncomfortable reminder that some phenomena lay beyond the reach of scientific method. Today, the sisters survive mostly as a medical footnote. Occasional academic references appear in papers on interoception, the perception of internal bodily states, as a speculative early example of extreme interoceptive awareness. Neurologists who study the limits of human self-regulation sometimes cite the Blackwells in passing, noting that their abilities, if authentic, anticipated modern research into conscious control of autonomic functions. Yet without surviving biological samples, comprehensive journals, or verifiable documentation, their story remains classified not as discovery, but as anomaly. Still among the residents of the Ozarks, the legend persists. Those who wander near the overgrown remains of Pine Hollow Road describe strange moments of bodily awareness, an abrupt realization of heartbeat, a flash of internal warmth or cold, a sudden sense of blood pulsing beneath the skin. Some speak of fleeting visions when the air is perfectly still, as though the forest itself is breathing in rhythm with them. Skeptics dismiss such experiences as products of suggestion, the human mind responding to a century of ghost stories. Others whisper that something of the sisters' final experiment, their union of perception and physiology, never fully faded, lingering in the soil where their awareness once reached beyond the limits of flesh. The most provocative claim surfaced in 2018 when a neuroscience graduate student at an undisclosed institution allegedly gained brief access to sealed tissue samples housed in a restricted government collection. The specimens rumored to have originated from the Blackwell case were described as historical biological material of uncertain provenance. According to second-hand accounts, the student reported observing unusual neural structuring inconsistent with known human histology, echoing descriptions suppressed decades earlier. The samples were swiftly reclassified and the student's access revoked. No formal record of the incident exists, and so, the Blackwell mystery remains suspended between folklore and forbidden science. A century-long echo of two women who sought to know the body so completely that they may have dissolved the boundary between knowing and being. Whether the phenomena were real or imagined, the legacy of Martha and Elizabeth Blackwell endures as both warning and wonder, a testament to how far human perception might reach and what it might cost to cross that final threshold. The most recent chapter of the Blackwell story has no conclusion. Only a deepening of the same mystery that began in 1916. The alleged 2018 incident, the neuroscience graduate student who briefly examined restricted tissue samples, remains unverified. According to anonymous forum posts later deleted, the neural structures the student observed were not like anything in current medical literature. They appeared neither natural nor pathological, but deliberately reorganized as though someone had guided cells to form entirely new transmission pathways. No institution has ever confirmed these claims, and perhaps, as the student suggested in a closing comment, that is how it should remain. If the fragments attributed to Elizabeth Blackwell's final journal entry are authentic, they read like a farewell and a warning. To see completely is to lose the boundary between observer and observed. Martha and I now understand that some veils exist not to hide truth, but to protect us from it. The human mind evolved with certain perceptual limitations for good reason. To perceive too much too directly is to risk dissolution of the self. Yet once this path is begun, return becomes increasingly impossible. We stand at a threshold beyond which individual consciousness, as conventionally understood, may cease to exist. Whether what lies beyond represents transcendence or obliteration remains the final question we must answer for ourselves. The last official government reference to the case is a heavily redacted 1972 memo from a federal research division partially obtained under FOIA in 2019. The visible lines refer to historical case B17 and acknowledge that techniques derived from surviving documentation have yielded promising preliminary results in controlled settings, though ethical considerations preclude progression to the advanced stages described in the original subject's records. It closes with a stark question whether the reported final outcomes represent an actual breakthrough in human capability, or the documentation of a shared psychotic event remains unresolved. What persists in these scattered documents is the implication that Martha and Elizabeth Blackwell may have discovered or stumbled into a capacity beyond ordinary human perception, the ability to sense and influence the body's internal processes, perhaps even to dissolve the distinction between self and other. Whether they achieved transcendence or were destroyed by what they found is unknowable, and yet the legend lives on. Visitors to the overgrown site of the Blackwell home sometimes report subtle fleeting sensations, an abrupt clarity of their own heartbeat, the strange awareness of blood moving through veins, a momentary feeling that the boundary between themselves and their surroundings has thinned. The experiences vanish after seconds, leaving only normal perception behind. But they echo what the sisters themselves described: a brief crossing into a realm where the observer and the observed are no longer separate. This is all that remains a story that science cannot yet explain, a warning about the price of knowledge, and a question hanging at the edge of consciousness, if the threshold. The Blackwell Sisters crossed still exists. What lies on the other side?